You're watching or listening to Exhibit A, the conspiracy theory podcast for people who don't wear tinfoil hats, but maybe keep one in the drawer just in case. We take a long, uncomfortable look at American history. The parts they printed, the parts they buried, and the parts that might have been fiction from the jump. If you're here for sanitized versions of events, this ain't it. But if you're here to tug at the threads, flip the stones, and maybe lose a little faith in your high school textbooks or any other book, welcome aboard. I'm your host, Clayton Blackwood, Navy vet, retired lawman, and professional skeptic. This is It's All Propaganda. Let's talk about what they told us and what they left out. We present Exhibit A. That mandolin sure does sound pretty. The myth of Columbus. Columbus wasn't the beginning, he was a signal. A signal that the truth wouldn't matter if the myth served the empire. This episode isn't about tearing down a man, it's about lifting the veil on a machine that shaped your schoolbooks, a machine that carved lines on maps, a machine that took what was and redrew it into what served power. Columbus is just a thread we pull to unravel something much older and much deeper. Section 1. Myths before maps. Every October, millions of school children learn about a brave explorer who sailed the ocean blue in 1492. He was a visionary, they say. He proved the world was round. He discovered America, except almost none of that is true. Columbus wasn't the first to believe in a round Earth. He wasn't the first European to set foot in the Americas. That was likely the Norse, hundreds of years earlier, and maybe the Irish, hundreds of years before that. And he never reached North America. But he did do something monumental. He sparked an empire, not just in blood and land, but in story. He became a myth. It was an empire builder that Columbus should be remembered. Let's go back before 1492, before the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. Because when Columbus was getting lost in the Caribbean, there were already statues of the Buddha in Mexico, already Viking ruins in Newfoundland, already African ship routes traced in oral traditions from Mali. And if you look hard enough, you find maps that shouldn't exist, like the Perry-Rees map from 1513, drawn from even older sources. It shows Antarctica, ice-free. And if we mention the Perry-Rees map, we have to mention Saint Brendan the Navigator, a 6th century Irish monk who, according to the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbatius, I tried, he sailed west from Ireland with other monks on a journey to the promised land of the saints. His journey, which some believe reached North America, was recorded centuries before Columbus was born. And if we're talking pre-Columbian visitors, don't forget Leif Erikson. Around the year 1000, he landed at a place he called Vinland. Most scholars now place it somewhere between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, over 400 years before Columbus. So why does the myth of 1492 still dominate? Because it serves an empire. Columbus wasn't the beginning, he was a signal. Section 2. A Man Without a Country. Christopher Columbus, born maybe in 1451, Maybe in Genoa, Italy? Maybe not. See, Spain financed him, but he never wrote in Italian. Not once. He wrote in Portuguese and Spanish. He signed his name Ho Farenz, a Latin Greek hybrid meaning Christ bearer. He called himself Cristóbal Colón in private letters. So, who was he? And more importantly, who was he working for? There's a little town in Alentejo, Portugal, called Cuba. Not the island. This here is the original. It's quiet now. Red roofs, whitewashed buildings, olive groves. But ask the locals, and they'll tell you Christopher Columbus was born here. The town has a statue of him, a museum, and a cluster of nearby towns with names that later appear in Columbus's logs, names he gave to Caribbean islands. Coincidence? Maybe. But it gets stranger. Some researchers believe Columbus wasn't born Cristóbal Colombo in Genoa, but rather Salvador Fernandez Zarco, the illegitimate son of Prince Fernando, Duke of Beja and Viseu, a member of the Portuguese royal family. Fernando was the brother of King Edward of Portugal, a high ranking noble with deep ties to the Order of Christ, the secretive successor of the Knights Templar in Portugal. Columbus was born in secrecy and given an alias, Zarco, linking him to João Gonçalves Zarco, one of the Portuguese navigators who helped settle the island of Madeira. Born of noblemen, conceived outside of marriage, raised under another name. It would explain his access to royal circles, his education, and his obsession with navigation. And then there's his mother. Some believe her name was Susanna Fontanarosa, a Jewish woman, possibly from a converso family. Jews who had been forcibly converted to Christianity in the decades before the Spanish Inquisition. Historical documents are murky, but circumstantial evidence suggests Columbus was deeply aware of his Jewish customs. He kept kosher diets on his voyages. He had close ties to Louise de Saint-Nagel, a wealthy Jewish converso who helped fund his voyage. And he departed on his first journey the same day Spain issued the Alhambra Decree, the edict that expelled Jews from Spain, August 3rd, 1492. Was that date a coincidence or a message? Many of his crew were conversos and Sephardic Jews fleeing persecution. To them, the voyage wasn't just a gamble, it was a lifeline. So now picture this: a man raised in secrecy, the illegitimate son of Portuguese nobility, mother possibly Jewish, living under constant threat, fluent in Portuguese, writing in Spanish, never once writing in Italian. A man who knew the right people, had access to secret charts, and carried the symbol of the Order of Christ on his sails. Not the Red Catholic Cross of Spain, the Templar Cross of Portugal. So, what if Columbus never changed sides? Some historians propose he was a double agent, sent by Portugal to waste Spain's time, to draw them away from Africa and the East, while Portugal quietly grabbed everything south of the equator. How? By convincing Spain he had a shortcut to Asia, by deliberately underestimating the circumference of the earth, and by landing, not in Asia, but in the Caribbean, exactly where Portugal already suspected land existed. Maybe from other pre existing maps. And if you trace the threads further, they all lead back to the Order of Christ, the secretive order that inherited the Templar fleet, knowledge, and rituals after 1312, when the Pope disbanded the Templars. They just gave them new robes. Columbus, some say, was one of them. You know, father, mother, his signature, his sails, his giant Adam's apple. Not a wandering Italian dreamer, but a trained navigator, a nobleman's son, and possibly an agent of a shadow empire. Was he trying to escape persecution, reclaim holy lands, or simply play both sides? We may never know for sure, but we do know what happened next. He sailed west, and everything changed. Section 3, Hidden Orders. Columbus's father-in-law was a knight of the Order of Christ. Some say Columbus's father was a Templar Grand Master. Remember, the Templars weren't just warrior monks. They were bankers. They were navigators. They were data hoarders. They collected maps, sea routes, and ancient texts. When they were crushed in France, much of that knowledge vanished underground. Or maybe not. Maybe it was just rebranded. Masons, Rosicrucians, Portuguese orders. Whispers of this show up in Columbus's logs, cryptic references, sacred geometry. And who endorsed this voyage? The Catholic Church. But which part? The same Spanish church that was expelling Jews and Muslims in 1492. Columbus's own family may have had Jewish roots. Some scholars say his mother was a conversa, a Jew forced to convert. Was he hiding his lineage, protecting secrets, or fulfilling a mission passed down through generations? Papal bulls and the divine right to conquer. To understand how Columbus became the signal, you have to understand the papal bulls. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued Dum Diversas. It granted the King of Portugal the right to, quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, end quote. Let that sink in. This wasn't just religious rhetoric, it was international law, the divine endorsement of colonization and enslavement. Then, in 1493, right after Columbus returned from his first voyage, Pope Alexander VI issued Inter Caetera. This bull drew a line through the Atlantic and handed the newly discovered lands to Spain, so long as they Christianized the inhabitants. Convenient. This is the legal foundation of the doctrine of discovery, still cited in U.S. Supreme Court decisions as recently as 2005. These bulls weren't about salvation, they were about domination. They gave Europe the moral cover to erase entire civilizations. And Columbus? He wasn't just a sailor, he was the church's point man. He carried letters from the Spanish crown bearing these papal seals. He planted crosses as legal signatures. He wrote in his journal about converting souls, right after describing how he would enslave and butcher whole villages. The church wasn't on the sidelines, it was at the helm. Columbus wasn't the beginning, he was a signal. Section 4. Who were the Taino people? Before Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, the Taino were already established across vast regions of the Caribbean, from what is now the Bahamas to Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Jamaica. They were part of a larger Arawak language group, but the Taino developed their own distinctive culture and social organizations. The Taino were not the noble savages of later European imagination. They were highly advanced in many respects. They had a deep understanding of agriculture, astronomy, social organizations, and spirituality. Let's start with their arrival. When did the Taino settle in the islands? The Taino are thought to have arrived in the Caribbean around 2000 before current era, BCE, long before Columbus. That means the Taino had been inhabiting those lands for nearly 3,492 years before Columbus stumbled his way to their beaches. Their ancestors, the Arawak people, likely migrated from South America in waves, traveling by canoe along the coastlines. Over the centuries, they developed into a distinct group with a rich history and cultural identity. They didn't just stumble upon the islands, they established societies with complex rituals and customs that had been nurtured and perfected for thousands of years. The Taino's social structure was organized in a hierarchical system, but one that was matrilineal. What does that mean? It means that descent and inheritance were traced through the mother side. Unlike many patriarchal societies, the Taino world centered around the roles and status of women. Their chiefs, known as chachiques, were often chosen from the mother's lineage, and the spiritual leadership was frequently in the hands of women too. The Chachique was the chief of the village, a respected figure who not only wielded political power, but also played a central role in the spiritual and ceremonial life of the community. The Chachica, the female counterpart, often helped lead these ceremonies and had a significant voice in governance. Their co leadership reflects the importance of balance between the genders in Taino culture. Now let's explore their religion, a rich and fascinating belief system. The Taino had an elaborate pantheon of gods and spirits that governed their lives. At the center of the Taino religion was the belief in a supreme god named Yukahu, the god of cassava, their primary crop, sea, and fertility of the land. Yukahu was associated with the creation of the earth and the sustenance it provided. He was often depicted as a being who was both creator and provider. Another major deity was Atabe, the goddess of freshwater, fertility, and the moon. Atabe was often seen as the mother of the gods. She was deeply connected to the cycle of life, birth, death, and rebirth. She symbolized the nurturing aspects of nature and was revered by the Taino people as the source of all life. The Taino also believed in zimmies, spiritual entities that were represented in small statues made from wood, stone, or bone. These zimmies were revered and cared for by the Taino, and they played a key role in rituals and offerings. They were believed to house the spirits of ancestors and other deities. Some zimmies considered to be the souls of dead ancestors, while others were believed to have the power to influence the world of the living. Their worldview was deeply connected to the natural world, and everything had spiritual significance. The Taino believed that the islands were imbued with divine power, and their rituals reflected a desire to maintain harmony with the gods and the earth. Their ceremonies involved dancing, chanting, and offerings, and they would gather in a central ceremonial plaza they called bate, which often had a large stone ball court used for ritual games. But what about when Columbus and his men arrived? The Taino were initially curious about these strangers. They had no context for the violence and greed that the Europeans would soon bring to them. They saw Columbus and his men as strange beings, perhaps spirits or divine figures, but not necessarily hostile. They approached these newcomers with offerings of food, water, and gifts. They showed them hospitality, as was common in many indigenous cultures. But what did they actually see when Columbus and his men stepped ashore? They saw strangers, pale, strange, speaking in foreign tongues, and riding in ships made of wood and iron. The Taino might have been fascinated by the strange ships, their sails, and the firearms they wielded. They might have viewed these newcomers as gods, as beings from the heavens, not realizing that their divinity of the Europeans would soon turn into a nightmare. When Columbus and his crew first made contact, they traded with the Taino, giving them trinkets in exchange for gold, food, and information. But the relationship soon soured. Columbus quickly started to see the Taino not as equals or allies, but as a resource to be exploited. His men began demanding tribute in gold and labor. They took Taino people as slaves and started to establish encomienda systems, essentially forcing indigenous people into slave labor under the guise of protection and conversion to Christianity. But the brutality didn't stop there. The Taino were subjected to torture, rape, mass murder, and forced labor. Many died from diseases like smallpox brought by the Europeans, to which they had no immunity. The enslavement of the Taino went beyond physical abuse, it was psychological as well. In their land, culture, and in the entire way of life, they were being systematically erased. Imagine the horror the Taino must have felt. One day they were offering hospitality to strangers, and the next they were faced with violent subjugation and mutilation. The Taino who resisted were executed or tortured. In a matter of decades, their population was decimated by disease, by war, and by forced labor. From hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of Taino people, only a few thousand remained within a generation. The Taino probably saw Columbus and his men as beings with an almost otherworldly power, but they would have also quickly realized that these men were not benevolent. They were conquerors. They were taking everything from the Taino. The concept of ownership of land, wealth, and people was foreign to the Taino, and it would have been impossible for them to understand why these heavenly visitors would demand to take rather than to share. The Taino's response wasn't one of passive acceptance, it was one of resistance and survival. But the odds were stacked against them. With their population decimated by disease and their spirits crushed by violence, the Taino were largely wiped out by the mid 1500s. Those who survived were either absorbed into other indigenous groups or forced into slavery, often to work in the mines or on plantations that the Spanish had established. Though they were never nearly erased from history, their culture, language, and influence never completely disappeared. Words like hurricane, barbecue, and canoe come from the Taino language. Their spiritual beliefs influence the Caribbean and Latin American religions, and traces of their ways of life persist today in indigenous Caribbean cultures. The Taino were not passive victims. They were a proud, complex people whose world was shattered by an invader whose name is now synonymous with conquest. So when we think of Columbus, let's not forget the people who were here long before him. Let's not forget the Taino, who welcomed strangers but paid the ultimate price for doing so. Section 5: The Myth Machine. What happens when a lie is more powerful than the truth? It becomes history. That's true throughout all of human history, and the myth of Columbus is no exception. 1492 became a hinge point, a tool of imperial branding. It was the year the New World was discovered. Never mind the people who were already there. Never mind the Irish monks, the Vikings, the Malay sailors, because Columbus wasn't chosen for what he found. He was chosen for what he symbolized: empire, faith, expansion. Sound familiar? And in the smoke and mirrors, the old world disappeared. Maps were redrawn, myths were printed, statues were raised. Columbus wasn't the beginning, he was a signal that myth could be bought, sold, and weaponized. This is a good one. Section 6, Columbus Day, Italian Identity, and the Knights of Columbus. Columbus Day wasn't always a holiday. In fact, it didn't become a federal holiday until 1937 under Franklin D. Roosevelt. But why? To answer that, we have to fast forward from 1492 to the late 1800s. Italian immigrants were flooding into the United States, and they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. They were seen as dirty, poor, uneducated, and worst of all, Catholic. In 1891, in New Orleans, 11 Italian men were lynched by a mob after being acquitted of murder. It was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. A year later, in 1892, President Benjamin Harrison declared a one time Columbus Day celebration. It was damage control, a political apology wrapped in patriotism. But the real push came from the Knights of Columbus. Founded in 1882, this Catholic fraternal order was looking for a hero, someone who could stand toe to toe with Protestant founding fathers. They chose Columbus. Why? Because he was Italian, because he was Catholic, and because he could be recast as a founding father of the New World. And so they lobbied, funded statues, rewrote textbooks, got the holiday push through. The myth of Columbus was rebranded again, not just as an imperial mascot, but as an immigrant icon. But here's the twist: the real Columbus wouldn't have recognized the version that now wears the stars and stripes. Columbus wasn't the beginning, he was a signal that myth could be bought, sold, and weaponized. Columbus wasn't the beginning, he was a signal that truth wouldn't matter if the myth served the empire. Section 7, Why It Matters. This isn't ancient history locked away in dusty books. It's the foundation beneath our modern system of law, identity, and power. The Catholic Church, through papal bulls like Dum Diversos in 1452 and Inter Caetera in 1493, not only authorized conquest and enslavement, but embedded these justifications so deeply into Western legal thought that their fingerprints remain today. In City of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation of New York, 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court cited the doctrine of discovery, a legal principle rooted in 15th century papal decrees, to justify the denial of land reclamation rights to an indigenous tribe. A 21st century ruling based on a 15th century religious imperialism. That's why it matters. The church has long positioned itself above the law, not just spiritually, but legally and politically. Its global power allowed it to shield its own from accountability, whether that meant sanctioning genocide under a holy banner or hiding abusive clergy behind parish walls. For centuries, victims were silenced while the church operated as both judge and shield. The Western world was not built on liberty and justice. It was built on conquest, theft, and spiritual manipulation. Entire cultures were annihilated or erased. Histories were rewritten, identities destroyed, and people uprooted, all justified by a divine mandate that no one voted for and no one can appeal. To understand the West's current moral contradictions, its fractured identities, its unease with history, its selective memory, is to understand that the scaffolding was flawed from the start. Legitimacy was ca- Legitimacy was claimed through conquest, not consent. Authority was taken, not granted. And the echoes of these decisions still shape our courts, our governments, and our collective psyche. Look, Exhibit A isn't claiming to be the expert. I don't know exactly what happened in 1492, but I do know that when a story has this many holes, it's probably bullshit. And my brother or sister, the myth of Columbus, it's got holes. Here was what we can say based on the evidence we do have. Columbus sailed to the Caribbean in 1492. He did so under the presumed authority of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. At that time, Spain and Portugal were locked in a Cold War style struggle for global trade supremacy. Both nations were functionally vassals of Rome. Columbus never wrote in Italian, not once. He wrote fluently in Spanish and expertly in Portuguese. His personal journal, written in Portuguese. There's a town in Portugal called Cuba that claims to be the birthplace of Cristobal Colon, a name he used for himself. He had ties to secret orders that were connected to ancient knowledge. And those ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, they sailed under the Templar cross. All I'm saying is, what we were told about Columbus in school doesn't hold water. And you don't need a PhD to smell bullshit. Next time, a monk nails a thesis to a door and Europe fractures in two. What began as spiritual protest becomes political warfare. Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation, England's break from Rome, and the seeds of a new kind of colonizer. But what of the people they found waiting? We won't tell the pilgrim story without telling their story too. See you, boys and girls, next time on Exhibit A.